Welcome to part 4 in our series on grounded language understanding. Our topic is varieties of contextual grounding. What I'd really like to do is make connections with additional tasks as a way of drawing out what I think is one of the central insights behind the work that we're doing, which is that speakers should try to be informative in context. Let me explain a bit more about what that means. So our task is this task of color reference in context. The speaker is given 3 color patches, one of them designated the target. And the speaker's task is to communicate which of the 3 is the target to the listener, who's in the same context, but of course doesn't know what the target is. And what I think you see running through the human data here is that speakers are striving to be informative in context. In this first case, the speaker can just say blue because the contrasts are so clear. But in the second case, merely saying blue would be really unhelpful. It would be uninformative in the context because there are these 2 blues. And as a result, the speaker is pushed to do something more interesting, the darker blue one, making implicit reference to the context in an effort to communicate effectively with the listener. And that communication aspect, I think, can be so powerful and runs through lots of tasks, both ones that explicitly involve communication and ones that involve a more general setting. One case of the latter is, I think, discriminative image labeling, which is tackled in this lovely paper, Mao et al. 2016. The task here is given an image to label entities that are in those images. And for many, many contexts, it would be a shame if our goal was to label these 2 entities here and we simply called them both dog. It's uninformative in the sense that it doesn't distinguish the 2 entities in the context of this picture. What we might hope is that we would get fuller descriptions, like a little dog jumping and catching a frisbee and a big dog running, fuller descriptions in the sense that they provide more detail that distinguishes the 2 dogs. And we could extend that to full image captioning as well. Again, given these 3 images, it would be a shame if our image captioning system just labeled them all dog. We might have the intuition that we would like the image captioning system to produce descriptions of these images that would help a listener figure out which image was being described. And we might have as a further goal for this image captioning system that as we change the set of distractors, it's sensitive to that and produces different descriptions, trying to be informative relative to these new contexts that we're creating, amplifying some kinds of information and leaving out other kinds of information to the extent that they would help the listener achieve that task of figuring out which image was being described. Machine translation is another area that might benefit from this notion of informativity in context. This was explored in a lovely paper by Reuben Cohen-Gordon and Noah Goodman in 2019. So let's say our task is to go from English to French. Reuben and Noah just observed that at the time, these 2 English inputs, she chopped up the tree and she chopped down the tree, were both mapped to the same French translation, which is a shame given how different those 2 English inputs are in terms of their meanings. What we would like is to have the English inputs mapped to different French sentences. And their intuition about how to achieve that was to achieve some kind of invariance so that given the translation from English to French, we should be able to do the reverse, figure out from the French which underlying English state was being, quote, referred to in this context. So it's language on both sides, but it's drawing on this idea that we want translations that are informative in the sense that they would help someone figure out what the original system input was. Same guiding idea, drawing on this metaphor of communication, but now to achieve good translations. And in other domains, it's just very intuitive to think about informativity in context. So Daniel Fried et al., they have a lovely paper exploring how to give navigational instructions, drawing on pragmatic ideas like informativity in context. And for example, they have both speaker and listener agents, and they observe that the base speaker is true but uninformative, whereas their rational speaker, which brings in pragmatic ideas, is more sensitive to the kinds of information that a listener would need to follow an instruction. And the same thing is true on the listener side. The base listener is unsure how to proceed, but the rational listener is able to infer that since this instruction didn't mention this couch over here, it was probably not relevant to the instruction, and therefore this listener stops at this point in interpreting the navigational instructions. And Stephanie Telix and colleagues have explored this idea in the context of human-robot interaction. They've called their central mechanism inverse semantics. And this is, again, just the intuition that a robot producing language ought to produce language that reduces ambiguity for the human listener. In this context here, where the robot is trying to get help from the human, it shouldn't just say, help me. The human won't know how to take action, but it also shouldn't do something simple like, hand me the leg. The robot should be sensitive to the fact that there are multiple table legs in this context, and the robot needs to ensure that the human listener is not faced with an insurmountable ambiguity. And that would therefore push this robot in being aware of the listener state to produce descriptions that were more like, hand me the white leg on the table, fully disambiguating from the perspective of the listener. And I'd like to push this idea of informativity in context even further by connecting with one of the classic tasks in machine learning, which is optical character recognition. Even this task, I believe, can benefit from notions of contrast and informativity in context. On the left, I have 4 digits, and you can see that this is a speaker who puts little hooks at the top of their ones and slashes through their sevens. And those 2 pieces of information would help us disambiguate the final digit and infer that it was a 1. On the right here, we're pushed in a very different direction. This is a speaker who does not put hooks on the top of their ones or slashes through their sevens. And that would lead us to think that this final digit here is a 7. Notice that in terms of what's actually on the page, these 2 digits are identical, but the context is what's leading us in very different directions. And we can assume that some fundamental level, the speaker is going to be informative in the sense that they're going to write in ways that are consistent and draw intended contrast between their digits. And that's what guides us toward what are ultimately the correct classification decisions, even for this apparently mechanical seeming environment.